Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. Today we'll be continuing our study on the prophecy found in Daniel chapter 8, where we read of the cleansing of the sanctuary at the end of a period that spanned 2300 prophetic days. In our last video we saw that there are two sanctuaries mentioned in the Word of God, the earthly and the heavenly, with the earthly ministration being a type or shadow or representation of the ministration of the heavenly. And we saw that this cleansing pointed to the removal of the record of sin from the sanctuary. In the earthly sanctuary, this was shown through types and symbols, but in heaven we saw the final reality of these representations. So let's begin where we left off in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 14. We read, "And he said unto me, Unto 2300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And it came to pass when I, even I, Daniel, had seen the vision, and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came I was afraid, and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision." And so in verse 16 and 17, Gabriel is sent to explain or to make Daniel understand the vision. Now this vision, the vision of Daniel 8, does not begin in verse 14 or only pertain to the sanctuary. The vision actually begins in verse 1, where it mentions a ram and different symbolic references. And so as Gabriel begins to explain, he starts from the very beginning of the chapter. And in verse 19 we read, "And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king." And so he continues to speak of these things, these kingdoms and kings, until we reach verse 26, where he references the prophetic period that we have been studying. Notice his words in verse 26, it says, "And the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told, is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it." And so in verse 26, Gabriel references the vision of the evening and the morning. Now in the Bible, the phrase the evening and the morning points to days. In the book of Genesis, we read repeatedly that the evening and the morning were the first day, the evening and the morning were the second day, and so forth. So Gabriel here is referencing the portion of the vision that pertains to days, namely the 2300 days found in verse 14. And so that would mean that as chapter 8 comes to a close, no explanation was given for the 2300-day prophecy. Neither was there any indication of when this period begins, as Daniel fainted before an explanation could be given. And so the chapter ends without that portion of the vision being explained. This will be relevant later on, so keep that in mind. Chapter 8 concludes with everything being explained, except that of the 2300-day prophecy. Now what I'd like to point out at this time is that this chapter is full of symbolic references, from beasts representing kingdoms to horns representing kings. The entire chapter is prophetic in nature. That lets us know that as we read of the 2300 days of this chapter, we are to understand this to be prophetic time, as everything in this chapter is prophetic in nature. Now that being the case, as we've seen in our previous videos, each day would represent 1 year, making this period 2300 literal years. The Bible teaches that in a prophetic context, a day represents 1 year. We can see this from the book of Numbers and the book of Ezekiel. And so the sanctuary was to be cleansed after 2300 literal years. So keep that in mind as we reference this period moving forward. Chapter 9 opens with Daniel in prayer, seeking understanding for what was shown to him in the previous chapter. That continues until verse 21, where Gabriel is again sent to make Daniel understand the vision. Now as we have seen, there was only one point in the vision of chapter 8 which had been left unexplained, and that was the portion relating to time, the 2300 prophetic days, after which the sanctuary was said to be cleansed. And so Gabriel, in resuming his explanation, dwells exclusively on this period of time. It reads in verse 21, "Yea, whilst I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. And he informed me and talked with me, and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications the commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter, and consider the vision. Gabriel here tells Daniel to consider the vision, meaning bring to mind the portion that is still not yet understood. He bids him to consider this 2300-year period. He then says in verse 24, the very next verse, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And so after bidding Daniel to consider the vision in verse 23, the very next words of the angel are, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. The phrase thy people refers to the Jewish people and their city, and the word here translated determined literally means to be cut off. And so 70 weeks or 490 days, which represents 490 literal years, are declared by the angel to be cut off as especially pertaining to the Jews. But the question is, from what is this time period cut off? Well, given that the 2300 days was the only period of time mentioned in chapter 8, and it was the very portion of the prophecy that Gabriel was sent to explain, it must be the period from which the 70 weeks were cut off. The 70 weeks must therefore be a part of the 2300 days, and the two periods must begin together. And so in verse 25, we are then given the commencement of these periods. We are told that it is to be reckoned from the going forth of the commandment or decree to restore and to build Jerusalem, because at that time Jerusalem lay in ruins after its destruction by Babylon. And so if the date of this decree could be found, then the starting point for this prophetic period could be determined. Now there were actually 3 decrees made for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its temple. The first was made by Cyrus the king. He initiated the rebuilding of the Jewish capital, but as he died, the work of rebuilding the city and the temple came to a halt for several years. There was then need of a second decree, this time by Darius, the 3rd king after Cyrus. He commanded that the work be resumed, and thus it continued throughout his reign. But again, as he died, the work again came to a halt. A final decree was then issued years later by Artaxerxes, another king in the Persian succession, to complete the building of Jerusalem. And it was under this decree that the temple was finally rebuilt and Jerusalem completely restored. The Bible regards these 3 decrees as one decree, as the 3 kings did one work. It was begun by Cyrus, carried forward by Darius, and completed by Artaxerxes. Notice Ezra chapter 6 and verse 14, it says, And the elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet, and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And so these 3 kings, in originating, reaffirming, and completing the decree, brought it to the perfection required by the prophecy to mark the beginning of the 2300-year period. Artaxerxes gave this final decree to complete the restoration of Jerusalem in the year 457 BC, and thus we have our starting point for this great prophetic period. 2300 years from the year 457 BC brings us to the year 1843 AD. Now with this information we can finally answer the question from our previous video, and that was what sanctuary is being referenced as being cleansed in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 14, the earthly or the heavenly. While in the time of Daniel, there was no earthly sanctuary then existing, as the temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And in the year 1843, when the 2300 years would expire, there was again no sanctuary upon the earth to be cleansed, as the Romans destroyed the last temple recognized by God in the year 70 AD, after the Jews rejected Christ, long before the 2300 years would expire. And so as far as the prophecy is concerned, there was no sanctuary to be cleansed upon the earth at the times specified. Now if issue is taken with using the principle set forth in the word that a day in prophecy represents 1 year, and you count 2300 literal days instead of prophetic ones, making the prophecy have a duration of just about 6.5 years, it still leaves for no earthly sanctuary to be cleansed. At 6.5 years after 457 BC, the Jewish temple would still have been under construction, as we are told in the book of John that it took 46 years to complete. And so at 6.5 years after the decree in 457 BC, again there was no sanctuary upon the earth to be cleansed. Also, ignoring the day for a year principle disrupts the fulfillment of the events that were to take place within the 70-week period that were specially cut off for the Jews. But we'd speak about that at another time. And so by these facts we understand that it can only be the heavenly sanctuary that is being referenced in Daniel 8:14 as being cleansed. 2300 years from the year 457 BC brings us to the year 1843 AD. And so at that time Jesus Christ, our high priest, began the work of cleansing the heavenly sanctuary of its record from sin. The antitypical day of atonement had begun. The final thing that is important to note is that the dates mentioned here are to be understood as Jewish time, as it was spoken to Daniel, a Jew, at a time where there was only one recognized way of reckoning months and years as far as the Bible is concerned. So 2300 years from 457 BC takes us to the year 1843 Jewish time. Now in the Gregorian calendar of today, the Jewish year 1843 would span from March 1843 to March 1844, as the two calendars are not congruent or aligned. And so if the decree of Artaxerxes was given at the beginning of 457 BC, the prophetic period would terminate at the end of the Jewish year 1843. The entire year would have to pass for the time to be fulfilled. And as we have mentioned just now, the end of the Jewish year 1843 aligns to March 1844 in the Gregorian calendar. But that was not the case. The decree of Artaxerxes was given near the close of the year 457 BC, and as a result, the termination of the prophetic period would extend to the fall of 1844 in our calendar. And so at that time, Jesus Christ, our high priest, began the work of cleansing the heavenly sanctuary from its record of sin. The antitypical Day of Atonement had begun, and the sins of believers, beginning with Adam, were now being blotted out. We are now living in this solemn hour, and only those that ally themselves with Christ will have their sins blotted out from the books of record in the heavenly sanctuary. My prayer is that we will do just that we will put away the sins that so easily beset us, and commit our lives to the God of heaven. Take care.